Back to lecture number 95. This is historical topic 9.6, challenges of the 21st century. Our theme is America in the world, and this is our second to last lecture of the entire course. I know you're sad, but let's get excited because that means that the AP exam is just around the corner. We have one learning objective today. It's our second to last learning objective of the course. That is, explain the causes and effects of the domestic and international challenges the United States has faced in the 21st century. So, starting with these challenges, the war on terror. So, in the wake of the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in 2001, the United States launched military efforts to gain against terrorism and lengthy controversial conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. So the 9/11 attacks were hijacked planes. You can see from the map they were hijacked from different airports: the Washington, D.C. Dulles Airport, Newark, Boston Logan, and they were rerouted by the hijackers. Some planes went to New York City, to the Twin Towers. Some were going back to Washington, D.C. One made it to the Pentagon, which is where the Department of Defense is housed. And then one was going to the White House, but the people aboard the plane attacked back against the hijackers, and they were able to bring the plane down in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, but there were no survivors as a result of that airplane crash. The attacks had been planned by a terrorist group called Al-Qaeda and their leader Osama bin Laden. Shortly after the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, the United States goes to war against Afghanistan because Afghanistan was controlled by the Taliban, who were giving refuge to Osama bin Laden. The Taliban were a group that were at first fighting the Russians or the Soviets in the invasion of 1980, and then were able to take over control of the country after the Soviets took their troops home in 1988. The United States invades and overthrows the Taliban. We put in place a new democratic government, weak as it may have been. They have a working democracy for the past about 20 years. And bin Laden was killed in a Navy SEAL raid in Pakistan in 2011. All right, we also go into a lengthened conflict in Iraq. Now, Iraq and Afghanistan are somewhat related because President George W. Bush, then in office, claimed that Iraq had ties to Al-Qaeda and had weapons of mass destruction. The United States invades without the support of the United Nations. The other countries in the Security Council did not believe that there was sufficient evidence to back those claims. And the United States, with a couple of allies, the UK being the main one, overthrow the dictator Saddam Hussein. Same Saddam Hussein who had been in power in the first Gulf War that had when Iraq attacked Kuwait. This time we overthrow Saddam Hussein, and again we put in place a democratic government, still trying to have that government control the rule or enforce the rule of law and have people's trust, but it's still there. In the end, there was no link to Al-Qaeda that was ever found through the war in Iraq. There were never any weapons of mass destruction found, but it also led to more U.S. criticism, not just because these two things that we had alleged were there never existed, but there were some prisoners of war that we took in, and there were cases of torture and violence against these prisoners in the Abu Ghraib prison. All right, so the war on terrorism sought to improve security within the United States, but also raised questions about the protection of civil liberties and human rights. So since those attacks, we created a new U.S. Department of Homeland Security. It combined a lot of the different agencies that were responsible for similar tasks in keeping the country safe. The U.S. Congress commissioned a report or investigation as to what happened on the day of September 11th and how it could have been prevented. And this was one of the recommendations, to try and centralize all of this information and all of these agencies under one agency. A new Director of National Intelligence position is created by Congress so that one person can be responsible for getting all of the information from the different agencies. This leads to greater heightened airport security with TSA. You might have seen them in an airport. They're the people that look through your bag to make sure that you're not traveling with anything that's sharp. They put you through the metal detector, and now through the more technologically advanced magnetic machines that can see if there's any other items inside of your pockets before you board your plane. All right, so the United States passed what was called the USA Patriot Act in response to the terrorist attacks, to try and find any more possible terrorist attacks before they are to happen. The federal government now can obtain wiretaps and call logs of suspected terrorists. The problem with this is that anytime that a suspected terrorist has communication with someone who is not a suspected terrorist, that information, that call could also be wiretapped. There were a lot of questions about personal privacy and searches without warrants. The extent of the leaks and the wiretaps, and the surveillance from the USA Patriot Act became more clear to the American people after a leak by a national security agency contractor named Edward Snowden sent all of the information that he found while working at the NSA and sent it to WikiLeaks. And it showed the extent of the surveillance. It showed that the United States government was probably overstepping its boundaries, more so than it was granted by the USA Patriot Act. And we also have questions about what's to do with these suspected terrorists or alleged terrorists once we have apprehended them. We still have a prison in Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, and that's where we are holding suspected terrorists. Even to this day, there are still about 40 prisoners, and there have been many calls starting during the Bush administration to shut down the prison because there are questions over habeas corpus. That means that some of these prisoners may be held without actually being told what their charges are or without having an opportunity to have their day in court. There were two Supreme Court cases, Hamdi versus Rumsfeld and Hamdan versus Rumsfeld in 2006, which tried to address these questions about habeas corpus, and also the case of what happens when an American citizen is held at Guantanamo Bay. These two court cases limited the powers of the U.S. government and the military to hold suspected terrorists, or to at least give them a higher degree of habeas corpus rights. But as I said, that prison continues to exist, and prisoners continue to be held in Guantanamo Bay. All right, so conflicts in the Middle East and concerns about climate change led to debates over U.S. dependence on fossil fuels and the impact of economic consumption on the environment. So let's talk about the conflicts in the Middle East first. Beginning in 2011, there was a movement across North Africa and the Middle East called the Arab Spring, in which citizens of these countries started to protest against what were more authoritarian leaders who happened to be in power either through rigged elections or through no elections at all. The United States was providing aids to some of these countries to different degrees, whether it was Libya, Egypt, Syria. A lot of the times we were aiding those who were asking for a greater degree of democracy in their country, and there were mixed results for these Arab Spring countries. Countries like Egypt and Libya were able to successfully oust the old leaders and dictators, but when it came to establishing a working democracy, that was a lot more difficult. So with all of these new governments and power vacuums, we have a new terrorist organization begin to take hold of the region, ISIS or ISIL. This stands for the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or the Islamic State in the Levant. The Levant is the older term for that geographic region. So this group begins to take control of certain towns. They overtake some oil refineries and they begin to capture that oil and sell it in order to fund their operation. It was led by a fundamentalist Islamic sect led by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He will eventually be killed in a drone strike by the United States. Kurdish forces in northern Iraq were actually central to the defeat of ISIL. They were being given weapons and aid by the US government and by the Iraqi government, and they were able to successfully take back some of the towns that ISIS or ISIL had conquered in the north of Iraq. And so if you look at the map, this orange country here is Iraq, and then this dark maroon country is Syria, and so that's where most of the ISIS fighters were concentrated. All right, so now as far as fossil fuels, OPEC, which we learned about in period 8 and even period 7, or at the end of period 7 when it was created, is still around, and they're still controlling the price of oil because they control the largest share of the market. And because at different parts of the early 2000s, oil prices were high across the world, the United States started to look for alternatives. One of these alternatives is called fracking. And it's different than regular oil drilling. It consists of using large amounts of water being pumped into the ground and then being pumped out. And so it has a greater environmental cost than regular oil, but it made oil prices cheaper for some time. We're still looking for other energy alternatives, some that are not going to continue to hurt the environment. As far as environmental concerns, there are two environmental international treaties that you should know. The first one is the Kyoto Protocol, signed in 1997 by the majority of the world, and it was committing countries to reduce greenhouse gases emissions. The countries involved in the negotiations were able to, again, pick their own level of commitment, but the United States Senate did not ratify it in fear that we would be bound by other international organizations. The 2015 Paris Climate Accords was very similar to the Kyoto Commitment, and the United States joined, not wanting to have the same error or the same situation as happened in 1997 to Bill Clinton. President Obama entered into the agreement through an executive agreement. So it is a different type of constitutional way for the United States to commit to an international deal that does not require Senate approval. But because it does not require Senate approval, it is also a lot less permanent. So any president could back out through their own executive powers. And so there was a U.S. withdrawal under Trump, and then under the new Biden administration, on his first day, he recommitted the United States to the agreed upon levels of CO2 reductions on his first day in office. All right, so economic and foreign policy changes. Despite economic and foreign policy challenges, the United States continued as the world's leading superpower in the 21st century. For the economic challenges, the dot-com bubble burst in 2001. We alluded to this in the previous lecture about technology, and tech stock prices plummet. You see in the top chart how investments in new businesses completely drop in 2001 and 2002 because the dot-com bubble had burst. And it takes a long time for that level of business investment to catch back up to previous levels. Then we also have the Great Recession, which was caused by subprime mortgages. This was when banks were lending money to untrustworthy borrowers because investment banks were buying those mortgages from the banks as a way to make money. Eventually, those untrustworthy borrowers stopped paying their mortgage, which led to a lot of toxic assets in the books of investment banks and regular banks. This led to bank failures, which led to a slowing of economic activity and unemployment, which went all the way up to 10.6%. The government response was very similar to that of FDR during the Great Depression, in which the United States was passing legislation to create economic stimulus. There was one round of stimulus passed in the Bush administration, very late in his administration as he was already leaving, and then another larger round of stimulus during the Obama administration, which totaled about 800 billion. To give you a sense of the magnitude of what that was, in the current pandemic and economic crisis, we have passed several different pandemic stimulus packages that have all been larger than the Economic Recovery Act of 2009. So it shows you the sense of scale of what the economic effects were of the current pandemic. All right, foreign policy challenges. We've talked about the prolonged involvement in Afghanistan and Iraq. There have also been a rise of cyber attacks, most recently by Russia. They hacked government agencies at the end of 2020 and early 2021. And just now, the United States has been able to try to quantify the extent of that hacking attack and what information Russia was able to see. It's leading to a new heightened tensions between the United States and Russia, which continues to escalate by the United States and Russia expelling each other's diplomats. But despite all of this, the United States is still a leading world superpower. A lot of that has to do with the strength of the U.S. economy. It continues to be the world's largest economy by GDP, and especially by GDP per capita. This has been true since the end of World War II, and it has been that growth that happened in the mid-20th century and the continued growth, technological innovation that has led to the United States to become the strongest economic power, and by becoming the strongest economic power, we have the most influence. We also have the largest defense spending per capita, and so one of the strongest military in the world. All right, so that was it. The United States began a war on terror in response to the terrorist attacks on 9/11. The war on terror increased security but brought on questions on civil liberties. The United States energy policy has been more debated with concerns of environment and reliance on foreign powers for oil. And finally, the United States is still a leading superpower despite economic and foreign policy challenges. All right, thank you for watching. Please come back for that last lecture, number 96. Best of luck to you in all of your tests and all of your studying, and I will see you for the last one next